Democracies in Parliament. And then we had an event in October on the question of youth and their relationship to democracy. In November, there was an event on foreign intervention in democratic elections, and then one on the question of immigration. Today, we continue the discussion with the question of, is America becoming less democratic? And I think that although this question appeals to us as we sit here in our domestic home of the United States, it is really no less global in its focus than the other events we've been having so far this year. How American democracy fares has a big impact on democracy around the world. And I say that in full awareness, I think, of America's ambiguous, at best, connection to world democratization. We know that many times America's promotion of democratic values has come in the form of violent intervention in other countries' affairs. And we also know equally that many times America has not been on the side of democracy and has facilitated anti-democratic military coups, as in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, and recently in Honduras in 2009. Still, I think a great deal of America's institutions and acts of advocacy and values do promote democracy, with the result that if it is true that America is becoming less democratic, that would be a problem not just for those who value democracy here at home in America, but for people around the world. And we're very lucky to have with us tonight two very distinguished guest speakers, and Mark Meredith, our own political scientist from Penn, as the moderator. Siva Vaidhyanathan is the Robertson Professor of Media Studies and Director of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. He's also a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities. He's the author or editor of 6 books, including most recently, Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, which Penn's own Kathleen L. Jamison has called, quote, an eye-opening and provocative examination of the unintended consequences that Facebook inflicted on the global community it created. Anti-Social Media was recently named as one of NPR's best books of 2018. Siva's previous full-length book, The Googleization of Everything, received the 2011 McGannon Award for Social and Ethical Relevance in Communications Technology Research. He is also, as the Chronicle of Higher Education called him, quote, one of academia's best-known scholars of intellectual property and its role in contemporary culture, having published 3 books on that topic. Siva has testified as an expert before the U.S. Copyright Office and served on the board of the Digital Public Library of America. Formerly a reporter himself, Siva appears regularly in the most visible media outlets, including those of print, radio, television, and internet, and has written pieces for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the Nation, and countless other periodicals. He is open about the influence of music on his writing and work, crediting rap music with inspiring the ideas for his book, Copyrights and Copywrongs, and Chuck Berry with, quote, lighting his path to cultural citizenship. Ari Berman is a senior reporter at Mother Jones and a fellow at the Nation Institute who writes extensively on voting rights and voter suppression. His most recent book is called Give Us the Ballot, in which Ari offers a comprehensive history of 50 years of contention over the Voting Rights Act. The book was named a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award and put on Book of the Year lists by the New York Times Book Review, the Washington Post, NPR, and the Boston Globe. Congressman and civil rights activist John Lewis called Ari's book, quote, a primer for every American. Before becoming one of the first, if not the first, national reporters to write about voter suppression around the 2012 presidential election, Ari previously had published the 2010 book, Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics. Ari was formerly a senior contributing writer at The Nation magazine, and his stories have also appeared in the Rolling Stone, The Guardian, and the New York Times magazine, for which he wrote a penetrating profile of Chris Kobach, the head of President Trump's now disbanded voter fraud commission. He's also a frequent guest and commentator on MSNBC and NPR, among other outlets. Finally, we're pleased to have as our moderator this afternoon Mark Meredith, my friend and colleague in Penn's Political Science Department. Mark's wide-ranging research investigates so many topics in American politics, including the prevalence or lack thereof of fraudulent voting in the United States, the evaluation and critique of proposed schemes to reduce alleged fraud, the exploration of the impact of voter ID laws on likelihood of voting, and numerous research questions surrounding the topic of felon disenfranchisement in the United States. In addition to having a reputation for pursuing his research designs with incredible care, rigor, and creativity, Mark is a genuine expert in American politics, both national and local, and we're grateful for his being here today. Before I turn things over to the speakers, I just want to thank the planning committee for his work to put on all of the events this year in our Democracy in Trouble series. Mitchell Ornstein, the program chair, Kristen Gotze, Dan Kellerman, Marlon Crady, who played a large role in organizing the event for today, and Barbara Zelitzer. And one last shout out would be to our students, our undergraduate and local area high school students who are taking a course called Democracy in Trouble from a Latin American perspective. And they have read the contributions of our speakers today for their class, and we look forward to their engagement and thank them for all they've done this semester for being here and being part of the program. So thank you all. We look forward to the event.
I'm really excited to be here and hear from our very distinguished speakers. We're going to start by having each of them give a brief presentation, maybe about 10 minutes or so, and that'll start hopefully facilitating some questions that we can open up to the room, and especially excited to hear from all the students who are here today. So I think we decided Ari would go first, so go take it away.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yes, excellent. Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon, and thank you to the University of Pennsylvania for hosting me. Thanks to Jeff, thanks to Mark, great to meet you for the first time. Siva, I kind of feel like this question, is America becoming less democratic, should have an exclamation point, given, instead of a question mark these days. But really, so I cover voting issues, and if you think about this question, the answer, not to be a cop-out, but the answer is yes and no. That America is both becoming more democratic and more undemocratic at the same time. And I think if you look at the voting experience for people in the last election, this bears it out. That if you lived in a state like Oregon, for example, that had automatic voter registration and where everyone was sent to ballot, it was actually very easy to vote. Elections in Oregon were more democratic than ever. More people participated than ever before. But if you look at a state like Georgia, where people were purged from the voting rolls, where there were 4-hour lines, where there was a record number of disputed ballots, where the Secretary of State was overseeing his own election for governor, you would clearly say that things were becoming less democratic. This is not how democracy was supposed to be. As Carol Anderson of Emory University said, if the election in Georgia had been taking place in the former Soviet Republic, we would have condemned it as illegal. And so we're seeing these tensions right now, with some places becoming more democratic, some places becoming less democratic. And for me, I began covering this issue after the 2010 election, when a bunch of key states flipped from blue to red, and we began to see a wave of new attempts to make it harder to vote in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Florida and Wisconsin, states that would determine who the next president would be. And this wasn't just one tactic. There were a wave of new laws that were introduced to make it harder to vote. Things like requiring strict forms of ID to cast a ballot that you never needed in any previous election and that millions of Americans didn't have. Cutting back on early voting in states that had early voting. Aggressively purging the voter rolls. Making it harder to register to vote. Disenfranchising ex-felons. People always focus on one of these things or two of these things, but there were a bunch of different things that were passed. And nearly half the states in the country, 24 states, passed new restrictions on voting since the 2010 election. And many of these explicitly targeted students. In Texas, for example, you could vote with a gun permit, but not a student ID. Polling places were closed on college campuses. In the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, the county clerk said she didn't want to put an early voting site on a college campus because, quote, students might vote Democratic. In other states like North Carolina, they eliminated pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds so that when you were registered in high school, by the time you turned 18, you were already registered to vote. So I think it's really important to look at how young people in particular were targeted. So all of this happened after the 2010 election. Then, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act and ruled that those states with the longest histories of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. This was the most important component of the country's most important voting rights and civil rights law. This one provision of the Voting Rights Act had blocked 3,000 discriminatory voting changes from 1965 to 2013. And it's fascinating, because if you go back and read that decision, Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote it, says that voting discrimination is no longer flagrant or rampant or pervasive. Then you look at what happened in 2018 in places like Georgia, where there were 4.5-hour lines in some black communities, where 53,000 people were put on a pending registration list because information on their voter registration forms did not exactly match state databases, where 2.2 million people were purged from the voting rolls since the Secretary of State took office there. It wasn't one tactic, it wasn't two tactics, it was 5 or 6 different tactics. I talked to a young woman after the election. She was an 18-year-old student at Emory University. She told me she was so excited to vote in her first election. She went to the polls all the time with her parents. She moved to Georgia from Massachusetts, and she was so excited to vote in her first election. When she showed up to vote, she brought 3 different forms of ID to the polls. She brought her passport, her student ID, and her driver's license. But she was told she could not vote because she was not a citizen of the United States. She was born in the U.S., she's always lived in the U.S., but she was told she wasn't a citizen of the United States, and she had to cast what was called a provisional ballot. She cast a provisional ballot, and she went to the Board of Elections on the Friday after the election. I don't even know how people would bother to do this. She brought her passport, she confirmed her citizenship, they said her ballot would count. 5 days after the election, she checked, her ballot wasn't counted. And she said, it made me really angry that my ballot wasn't counted, but what made me even angrier was that this was happening to thousands of people in the last election, and I wasn't alone. And this is my biggest fear, is that we're allowing voter suppression to become normalized again. That 50 years ago we had things like poll taxes and literacy tests and property requirements and grandfather clauses. I can later explain what all of those things are. But we made a determination as a country that we were not going to go down that road anymore. That preventing people from voting was fundamentally wrong. For the students in here, I urge you to go back and watch Lyndon Johnson's speech on March 15th, 1965, introducing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He says in the speech, there is no Southern problem, there is no Northern problem, there is no Negro problem, there is only an American problem. That it is fundamentally immoral. He said it is wrong, deadly wrong, to prevent anyone from voting in this country. And we're allowing it to happen again. And we're rationalizing it. We're saying it's okay if you didn't vote because you didn't have the right ID. Or it's okay if you were removed from the voter registration rolls. Or it's okay if you can't vote because you committed one mistake in your life. I don't think that is okay. I don't think we should allow us as a society to think it's okay. So that's all the bad stuff that happened in the last election. The question of how the country is becoming more democratic is in the same election where we witnessed rampant voter suppression, 7 states passed ballot initiatives making it easier to vote, making it easier to register to vote, making it harder to gerrymander. That shows that people in a lot of different states, not just blue states, want to make it easier for people to participate. So Florida decided to restore voting rights to ex-felons, and that could enfranchise up to 1.4 million people in one of the country's most important swing states. Before the 2018 election, 1 in 10 Floridians, including 1 in 5 African Americans, were prevented from voting. So before the election had even begun, before anyone had even cast a ballot, over 1 million people were prevented from voting simply because of one mistake they had made. 3 other states, Michigan, Nevada, and Maryland, decided to make it easier to register to vote by passing things like election day or automatic registration, which I think is the wave of the future when it comes to being able to register to vote. 4 different states decided to make it harder to gerrymander. That even in conservative states like Missouri and Utah, they decided to make it harder for legislators there to gerrymander. So there is a lot of support for a pro-democracy agenda in this country. There's a lot of support for the country becoming more democratic. But we can only become more democratic if there's a consensus to do that. What we're seeing now is that one party in particular keeps trying to find ways to undermine the democratic process. You may have seen the news this week, but a bunch of states went back into what are known as lame duck legislative sessions after the election. What we saw, for example, in states like Wisconsin just elected a Democratic governor. So what did the Republican legislature do? They went back into session and stripped the Democratic governor of his powers. They went back into session and made it harder for people to vote. They went back into session, made it harder for the Attorney General who was just elected to be able to file lawsuits. We're talking about what was going on in other countries. The peaceful transition of power is one of the core principles in a democracy. Handing power from whoever wins the election, gets the most votes, is a core principle of democracy. Instead, we are seeing one party, first they're making it harder to vote. They're gerrymandering to keep power. They're falsely accusing people of stealing elections. And then when all of that fails and the other party wins, they then try to nullify the election result by overturning democratic elections. That is extremely disturbing. We are entering unprecedented territory here. And my fear is that I'm nonpartisan, I don't endorse candidates, and my fear here is that in a two-party system, when one party will not abide by democratic norms, America is destined to become less democratic. And so we are really at a crossroads here. We're really at a tension here going into 2020. Because these efforts are only going to get more intense as the next presidential election rolls around. And we have two options. We can be the kind of country where you have to wait 4 hours to vote, where you can purge 2.2 million people from the voter rolls, where you can block 53,000 people from registering to vote, where you can nullify election results if the party that you don't like wins an election. That's one road we can go down. We're seeing evidence of that right now. Or we can go down another road, which is a road of making it easier to register to vote, making it easier to cast a ballot, ensuring that more people participate, ensuring that there's less gerrymandering, and committing as a society that America should be more democratic and working towards that future instead of trying to go back to a different era in our society. So I'll end it there and happy to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. That was a really succinct summary of the mechanisms and structures of democracy that have changed so much so quickly. I have a different approach, one that I think layers upon what Ari brought out. I'm going to talk about all the things that have to happen before you actually get to the ballot, before you get to vote. All the things you have to think about and talk about with your fellow citizens. And the ways we are actually not very good at that. So let me start with a radically simplified anecdote. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland caught on fire. That's not supposed to happen. Right? That's like a biblical thing, right? The river is on fire. So in 1969, when the river caught on fire, it was major news, right? It actually wasn't the first American river to catch on fire in the 1960s. There have been a few before that, but it was right there in the middle of a major American city. Although I'm from Buffalo, I don't like to consider Cleveland major, but you know, not a lot of people. It was on the news every night, right? 3 major network news news programs covered it every night that it was engulfed in flames. Took a few days to put it out, to contain it and put it out. It's a pretty frightening moment. Within 2 years, a Republican president signed legislation to create the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. Now, the first thing didn't cause the second thing. But what the first thing did was solidify a problem, right? Visualize a problem, make clear that there was a problem that we as Americans had to address. It followed more than 20 years of a growing environmental movement trying to raise awareness of the variety of problems. And that had not been easy given the political and media ecosystems of the time. But the success was actually remarkable. And what we had in that period of time, roughly 1969 to 71, was a series of discussions and debates and deliberations about how we might address a problem like a river catching on fire. Now, that wasn't the only problem. There was trash along the highways everywhere in America. It was a constant blight, impossible to ignore. Los Angeles, most days of the year, it was impossible to breathe or see, right? There were a series of starkly visual problems with the environment in this country. But between 1969 and 1971, we had discussions, debates, deliberations. People argued, we need a strong state regulatory system where we have a collection of scientists who will do their best to determine the proper and upper limits of lead and mercury and other pollutants in our water, other pollutants in our air. And then we will have people come up with a series of penalties that we will levy upon polluters. And maybe even create systems through which we could clean up the damage that's already been done and assess the costs on the appropriate parties. It was quite an effort, right? Big proposal, a massive state intervention in our environment. And then there were other people who said, well, what about market-based interventions? Can we have incentive systems that would let private actors get involved in this and do what they can? And certainly industries that are likely to pollute might be less inclined to pollute if they face certain disincentives in the market. Maybe we can create whole market-based industries that would address pollution. And all of that happened to some degree, right? And then we had litigation raising the cost of polluting on top of all this. So we had a huge discussion. People with different political views and different political philosophies addressed the problem with their suggestions, and we had it out. And, to some degree, we had a mixed system come out of that. And to a large degree, we've unraveled the progress that we made in those days. That's another story. But in 1969, nobody stood up and said, I don't believe the river's on fire. In 2018, we can't even get to step 2 of that conversation, and the whole world is on fire, right? We have a much more serious problem than one river in Cleveland being on fire. And we cannot even have that public discussion about what we might do. What are the private sector interventions? What are the changes in incentives we might want to have the private sector deal with? What are the government interventions? What are the transnational interventions? We can't even get to that point where we have a grown-up conversation among informed citizens about our variety of choices to address the problem that is impossible to deny in good faith. And that's largely because somehow it's become possible to deny it in bad faith, and the question between good and bad faith doesn't seem to matter in the public sphere. Now, a whole lot of things have changed since 1971. The fact that we had a Republican president who cared enough about air and water to sign such legislation is one of the things that has changed, but that's not the only thing. We now live in a state of cacophony. We live in a state of constant distraction. We live in a loud, obnoxious, image-filled world. And that's actually kind of new to our species. If you think of all the things we read and all the things we study about how much we value expression, much of it comes from the 18th and 19th centuries, right? We read Thomas Jefferson. We read about the motivations for the First Amendment. We read John Stuart Mill, right? Works of classic liberalism are all designed for a quiet world. All designed for a world that doesn't have enough voices to make good decisions. Now, I don't want to idealize 1969 or 1971 because in those days we didn't have enough voices to make good decisions either. We got kind of lucky on the environmental stuff, but it took us a long time to figure out some other important questions that faced us, other questions of justice, other questions that might lead us toward a better life. Just because we got one thing right in 1971, it took us 4 more years to get a major war right? Things were not ideal in 1971, and you know what? Just in the United States, our media ecosystem at the time certainly allowed for some sort of coherence of knowledge, as limited as that knowledge was. 3 old white guys telling us that the river was on fire every weeknight had some virtue, but the complexity of the world's problems was far beyond their scope of concern. And so one of the things we started doing as a people and as a group of actors and as people who make media, people who consume media, people who demand media, people who study media, we started proliferating the voices. So by the late 1970s, people start subscribing to cable television and they're getting more than 3 or 4 or 5 channels. And we say, oh, this is nice, a few more voices. We've got this thing called Arts and Entertainment Network that will have opera on every night. You might remember this. It was like 6 months at A&E played opera. It was supposed to be like the new commercial PBS, right? And then we had cable access that was going to give local voices all of these options to talk about local problems and get a real audience and really break down that monopoly of the old white guy voice that dominated the news, right? That was all building in the late 1970s, early 1980s. By the early 1980s, we had the cable news network. Now we had 24-hour news. We had actual reporters going out covering news that wasn't covered at other times and displaying it to us at times of the day that we weren't used to getting news. By 1985, we had ESPN covering all sorts of weird sports we didn't even know existed. We had MTV bringing us music that we didn't know existed, right? The proliferation of images and sounds and information seemed glorious. I mean, I was a young person at the time. This was great, right? I look at my high school years, 1980 to 1984, that short period of time. The world was so much cooler by the time I graduated from high school. So much more interesting by the time I graduated from high school. And I had no idea what was yet to come, because by 10 years later, by 1994, if you were something more than a little child in 1994, I know some of you were, that magazine you picked up all of a sudden had a disc fall out, and you could pop it into a computer that you maybe just bought, didn't quite know how to use, and that little disc would connect you to other people. Now, all of a sudden, the proliferation of voices seemed infinite, and it seemed possible for everybody. Right? Kids growing up on Native American reservations in North Dakota, gay kids growing up in Omaha, kids growing up in the former Soviet Union were able to find people of like mind and able to encounter people of different mind. And this, again, seemed glorious. It seemed like we were solving the problems of a quiet world. The problems that, for instance, were the justification for the First Amendment. Well, look, we went so far and so fast as soon as the 21st century picked up. So far and so fast. And now we're at a moment of cacophony. We're at a moment where the dominant motif of our public conversation is a heckler, right up to the heckler-in-chief in the White House. And what we end up with in this cacophony, with millions of hecklers, is an inability to think collectively, an inability to think as grown-ups about serious issues in deep and serious ways in most of the ways that we engage. In most of the ways that we engage. In most of the ways that we consume. Right? Now, we do have technologies that contribute to one part of the strengthening of democracy. So Ari talked about, again, the mechanism of completing the act of being a democratic citizen. Every time you vote, that is like the culmination of, the time since you last voted, when you thought about the problems in your community and in the world and in your country, and you made up your mind about which representatives or leaders will carry out your agenda to the best of their ability, which leaders and representatives might be ethical, might be moral, right? All those decisions work through. Everything you've learned and heard and read and talked to about people funnel into this act of picking a leader. And again, that's the culmination. But in the absence of deliberation, that culmination becomes shallow. So the technologies we have now, and of course I'm talking about Facebook because I wrote a book about Facebook. And I'm not just talking about Facebook, but it is the most pervasive and most powerful of all of our media platforms these days. Facebook is great for motivation, and it's terrible for deliberation. Democratic republics need motivation and deliberation, possibly in equal parts. Facebook is the best possible tool we've ever had if you want to put 2 million women in the National Mall just after a sparsely attended inauguration. It's a great vehicle for finding 2 million like-minded people and asking them to be in a place at a time. It doesn't matter your political affiliation, that sort of motivation, that's exactly what Facebook's built for, right? You can identify the like-minded with very little investment in time and energy, and you can communicate the specifics of what you would like them to do, again, with very little investment. You can filter out the people who are uninterested in your message remarkably efficiently and effectively. It's great for all of that. But again, it's terrible for deliberation. And we need to be able to deliberate. We need to be able to think clearly about our issues, not just the climate, which I happen to think is the greatest threat. I hope most of you agree with me. It's the greatest threat to us as a species, collectively. But beyond that, parts of the world have much more urgent and short-term threats and challenges that we also seem incapable of discussing. We can freak out about a caravan and find like-minded people to freak out about a caravan of refugees coming from Honduras. We can also find the like-minded people who will stand up and call for decent treatment of refugees in a caravan just as easily. Again, motivating our side has never been easier, but we can't seem to have a grown-up discussion about what the heck's going on in Honduras and what the heck created the problem that pushed all of these people out of Honduras to risk their lives and risk their children and put their children in the path of tear gas. There's a big story, and it's one that, wouldn't it be nice if we could actually have that kind of analysis? Now, again, I don't want to idealize the past. There was never a golden age in this country when we could deliberate deeply about all of our problems. But every once in a while, we seem capable of getting something right. It seems to me that these days, we're not close to getting anything right. And so, the question, is America becoming less democratic? The answer is kind of, right? It's kind of. I don't think America has actually been all that democratic since its establishment, right? Not until 1920 could women vote in this country. That's a really short time. I was born in 1966. The year before I was born, that was the first point at which the United States said, yes, if you're African American, you are welcome to vote. If you're an adult over 21 who's not a convicted felon in many states and are a U.S. citizen, with all those qualifications, you could vote, right? 1965, the year before I was born, that's when America came close to being a functional democracy along the terms that Ari is talking about. I might put the beginning of the end in 2000, when 5 members of the Supreme Court decided that Florida should stop counting ballots and therefore ignore the will of the people, not only of Florida, but of the United States. And the Supreme Court, 5 members of it chose a president over the will of the voters. That was a pretty explicit rejection of democracy by one of our 3 branches of government. And for some reason, we didn't fill the National Mall with protests the next day. Not sure why that didn't happen. But since 2000, we've kind of been shaky on a number of these structural and functional and mechanistic issues, and we have been sliding back in our ability to actually think collectively, to respectfully engage with those who differ with us, and yet share a common set of facts about the world. Now, I don't want to pretend that there are simple answers to any of this. And there are hundreds of brilliant scholars who are working right now on trying to address this problem, describe this problem, and maybe even suggest a way forward. So there are smart people working on this stuff. Some of them are in this room. But we've just started thinking about a problem that is deeper than I think any of us have been willing to face. So that's pretty depressing. I'm gonna let you think about that. I have no cheerful, uplifting lines on which to finish. And for that, I apologize, but thank you very much.
So for those of you who saw the readings that our panelists submitted, Siva submitted a piece he authored in the New York Times about the events happening in Charlottesville last summer. So I'd like to get you to elaborate a little bit more on that piece and maybe link it a bit to what you're talking about with respect to social media. I thought one really interesting observation you had in there was that the Nazis who descended upon Charlottesville essentially could guarantee themselves media coverage via social media.
Right.
So I guess could you talk a little bit about the article at large, and then talk a little bit more about that specific point about how you think social media plays into the hands of Nazis and other people with white supremacist motivations?
So the Unite the Right rally in August of 2017, there were actually two rallies. One was August 11th, the evening. That was a surprise march against the University of Virginia. Thousands of young men with torches who were armed. They were all armed. Mm-hmm. And then the next day, the planned rally where many more thousands of white supremacists, Nazis, and others came flooding into downtown Charlottesville to surround a Robert E. Lee statue that the city has been hoping to dispose of, but is prevented from disposing of by state law. So really, like, the Robert E. Lee statue is not going anywhere. No one can figure out how to get rid of it anyway. And yet we were an ideal target for that, very visible target, kind of obvious target. And if you want to start a fight, it's a great time to start a fight if you're a bunch of Nazis, right? So that entire, talk about motivation, right? Social media motivation, that entire Unite the Right rally was organized through social media, different social media services. Facebook was one of them, but not the only one. Discord was a major site of that sort of organization. But there were also Reddit groups devoted to it, and a number of other services helping. We knew it was going to be big, and we knew there was going to be a lot of national media attention. That was just unavoidable. The article I wrote was my own confession that I had let my fellow citizens down. Political theorist Danielle Allen wrote a book a few years ago about citizenship. And her core argument was that one of the essential elements of citizenship is sacrifice. That we often expect our fellow citizens to sacrifice for people they don't know, have never met, might never meet. And her case study that she opens the book with involves the children of Little Rock, Arkansas, who desegregated Central High School in Little Rock. And the fact that these children were, we know they were brave, we know what they put up with, we know what kind of lives they built afterwards, we know that they were just remarkable examples for all of us. Their parents and the NAACP and a number of lawyers were all involved in making sure that that went down as it went down. There were a few glitches along the way. And this was, Danielle Allen was in some ways responding to an unfortunate essay that Hannah Arendt wrote after that event, in which she criticized the NAACP and these children's parents for using them as pawns in a political game. Allen was not comfortable with this position that Arendt had put forth, and basically, made the claim that this is essential to citizenship. What these children did was put their lives on the line, their safety on the line, for children yet to come, children who had yet to go to high school in Little Rock and elsewhere. They knew that what they were doing was for other people. It wasn't just for their ability to get into a better college and lead a better life. It was a risk they were taking for other people, right? So, in the weeks leading up to the, in Charlottesville, we call them the events of August 2017. We haven't figured out a good way to summarize what happened. Like everyone else in Charlottesville, my wife and I were trying to figure out what our response would be. We talked about being part of the group that would face them down, confront them, stand on the front lines. We knew that friends of ours were going to be setting up first aid stations to deal with the inevitable tear gas sufferers and bodily injury. No matter who the victims were, by the way, of tear gas or bodily injury, people were ready to help. And then others were going to be even more confrontational, not just link arms and block a road, but actually directly take on the Nazis. I like to think like my grandfather did in World War II. And we talked about all those different options, and there was yet another option, which was to stand down. Right? Because it was a line of thought, this was something our mayor had put forth, the president of the university had put forth, that people who put themselves in the face of these attackers on our community were going to make it more likely that things were going to get nasty, that things were going to get violent and deadly. And therefore, we should all withdraw. And in that case, I decided to be very selfish. I decided I'm a parent, I'm an educator. I will instead, my family will go to the university, because the university that day, Saturday, had set up a number of seminars, teach-ins about various issues that were surrounding what was going on, right? A nice community event that would let people at least pretend to be involved in the issues without actually putting their lives in danger. So I thought I'll bring my then 10-year-old kid and put her in one of those rooms. Well, it turns out all those things were canceled because the Nazis decided not to obey their own promises. Who would have thought? So we didn't end up even doing that. So I watched the entire event, including one of my neighbors get killed and 30 of my neighbors get run down by a car on television from about a mile away. And I am deeply ashamed of that. I'm deeply ashamed that I made that choice. Because I didn't make the choice that my friends and neighbors did. They, like those kids going to Central High in Little Rock, put their bodies on the line for me and my family. They were true responsible citizens. They took a chance and made a sacrifice and made a risk that I wasn't willing to make. And I'm ashamed of myself for that. So I wrote this piece in the New York Times basically confessing to the world that I wasn't the person I thought I was. I wasn't the person I had hoped to be. And I certainly, that day, did not act like the person I hope I am in the future. But here's the other part of that story that actually ties to what I was saying up there. The ACLU of Virginia blocked the city from moving that rally away from downtown Charlottesville. If you've ever been to downtown Charlottesville, you know that the streets were laid out in the 18th century, and therefore it's a lot like Boston. It's a lot like downtown Boston. Thus, bad for driving, right? And they're a tangled mess in the center of town. The city wanted to move the Nazi rally to a park where the police could set up barriers between angry sides. There could be helicopter and drone surveillance, and there could be easy police intervention if things got out of hand. That was the plan the city had set up. And 24 hours before the event, a U.S. District Court ruled that that was unconstitutional, that was a policy, a decision made by the city based on the content of the expression. And, just as importantly, that rallying around the Robert E. Lee statue was the essence of the content of the expression that the Nazis wanted to bring forward. And the basis in law that they used was based on the Skokie Decision from 1978 when Nazis wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, a town with many Holocaust survivors. The problem with that is that the Nazis in 1978 weren't carrying semi-automatic weapons. A Nazi march in 1978 was expression. That was political expression. Noxious political expression, but political expression nonetheless. When you have anybody bring a semi-automatic weapon into the scene, you are no longer talking about speech that is in any way free. The Second Amendment trumps the First Amendment. Right? And at that point, that's what we had. And the ACLU of Virginia did not want to recognize that the weapons were the problem. So instead of having a rally in a park that would have been controllable and probably no one would have died and fewer people would have been hurt, instead the Nazis rallied downtown. They completely busted through their plans that they promised the court they would adhere to. As I said, more than 30 people ended up in the hospital. One of my neighbors died. 2 state police officers died. The police backed off because they were outgunned by the Nazis. The state police did not have the sufficient body armor or weapons to confront the Nazis and keep them at bay. That's how bad it was. The other thing that the ACLU of Virginia ignored was the fact that that rally occurred 2 blocks from a synagogue on a Saturday. There were people trapped in there. Like, the Nazis marched down neighborhood streets. These are questions that our traditional First Amendment analysis does not consider. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have to look at the very presence of weapons in our society as elements of the heckler's veto. You're talking about hecklers taking various forms, and being willing to threaten violence is one of the most serious.
All right, I want to follow up, because you situated a lot of your article in Georgia. And so we had some events happen in Georgia this week I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, which was we had a runoff election for the Secretary of State down there. And the Secretary of State is the governmental office that has probably the most power to affect some of these policies that you wrote a lot about in Georgia. And we saw a lackluster turnout from both parties, with the Republicans having slightly larger lackluster turnout than the Democrats, and so they kept that office. I think this suggests that the people aren't necessarily affected by these policies, are not, or at least partisans who may be affected by these policies aren't mobilized around this issue. I guess, do you agree with that interpretation? And if so, what will have to change for people to get more involved in trying to think about voting rights as being one of their issues that are most important to them?
So I would kind of take issue with that interpretation, simply because, I mean, one of the things that happens, broadly speaking, is that people don't pay enough attention to local elections, to down-ballot races. They actually go a long way to determining how the voting process works. That Secretary of State candidates, for example, they don't make voting laws, but they often interpret and implement them. So the Secretary of State in most states is the top election official.